We've learned two different ways to show aggregate supply and aggregate demand in our class. Now, what I want to do is answer the question which a lot of students ask me, and that is, which one is the better graph? Well, the answer really is the same answer we always give in economics, which is, it depends. But let's look at the graphs and see how they're the same and how they're different. The first thing I've done is I have identified the classical range on each graph. Now, notice in the classical range a few things. First of all, these are vertical lines. And any increase in aggregate demand in this range will not increase employment, but will only increase price level. So let me show you. Let's say aggregate demand on the New Keynesian graph was to increase. You notice the only thing changing is the price level at equilibrium, not the employment. How about the new classical? If we look at the aggregate demand and the long run aggregate supply line, you'll notice it's the same idea. Employment is not increasing, but price level is. The classical range is best described by explaining classical economics thought. Now, classical economics started with 1776 with the father of modern economics, Adam Smith. Now, it's based on a few ideas. Okay, the first idea that's based on is something called Say's law. Say's law says, well, first of all, it's named after Jean Baptiste Say, a French businessman and economist. And the basic idea is that the more goods that are produced, the more these goods can constitute a demand for other goods. Well, what does that mean? Well, what that means is that the very process of making a good means that someone is receiving an income to make it. And that income is going to allow them to demand other goods. And so Say's law can be simplified to say supply creates its own demand. The second foundation of classical economics is a term that you've probably heard before. I know we've talked about it in class, and that is laissez. Hang on one second. Laissez-faire. Now, laissez-faire is the basic idea is that the government should leave the economy alone and it should stay out of the way of business. The basic idea is the ship will right itself, or that if left alone, things will balance out. For example, let's say that the economy is less than full employment because of a decrease in aggregate demand. So let's say aggregate demand was to decrease. And so let me make that line a different color. Okay. So let's say aggregate demand was to decrease. What would happen? Well, if aggregate demand was to decrease, our price level would decrease, correct? But our unemployment would increase. We'd have more people out of work. Well, according to the classical economists, if we are to leave this alone, the economy will be self-correcting. What they say is that as aggregate demand falls, that wages will fall, because as more and more people are out of work, they'll be willing to work for less money. And so as wages fall, that's going to cause the short-run aggregate supply curve to shift to the right. And so that brings us to a point where full employment has returned, but at a lower price level. The third foundation is flexible prices and flexible wages. Because remember, this is all assuming that if the government stays out of the way, that this will allow wages and prices to fluctuate through the market forces. And in the long run, the economy is going to work its way to full employment. This requires there to be these flexible wages and flexible prices. The fourth foundation, is that savings is a function of interest rates. Savings is a function of our interest rates. And what that means is that classical economists believe that as interest rates goes up, our savings goes up. They also believe that an inverse of this relationship happens to the business investment, that as interest rates goes up, investors invest less of their money. Now, for about 150 years, this classical economics was the main theory behind macroeconomics until John Maynard Keynes came along in the 1930s, and he revolutionized macroeconomics with a newer theory of economic thought, Keynesian economics. Well, what happened in the 1930s to cause this revolution in economics to come about? Well, of course, it was the Great Depression. Now, John Maynard Keynes wrote a book. It was called The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. And in this book, his main idea was that recessions and depressions occur because of inadequate aggregate demand in the economy. Okay, and so what he did is he created what's called the Keynesian range. And he disagreed with classical economists in several areas of economic thought. First of all, he disagreed with Say's law, that supply creates its own demand. What he said was that actually we need stimulus to aggregate demand to get the economy back to full employment. And so, as classical economists believe that supply creates its own demand, Keynesian economists believe that demand creates its own supply. And so that, let's say that aggregate demand was to decrease, and we were to now have a quantity of employment that was below full employment, that if we would just increase aggregate demand, that increase of aggregate demand would increase the quantity supplied. Now, he also said that the government should step in to help the economy. Unlike classical economists, where the government should stay out, Keynesian economics prefers government involvement. They want things to change. They believe that government should step in to help the economy. He felt that if we were in a recession or a depression, that expansionary fiscal or monetary policy is going to help get the economy back to full employment and bring our aggregate demand back to where it should be. He also believed in sticky wages and sticky prices. Unlike classical economic thought that believed that wages and prices are flexible, Keynes believed that wages and prices are sticky in the short run. And there's a lot of reasons we've talked about before: wage contracts, efficiency wages, menu costs. But for many reasons, he believed that wages and prices did not change as easily as the classical economists believe they do. He also believed that savings and consumption are a function of income. So remember, the new classical economists believe that savings is a function of the interest rate, that as the interest rate changes, we change out how much we want to save. Keynes believed that how much we save depends on how much our income is. And that's where that marginal propensity to consume and marginal propensity to save, those formulas come in. Those are all Keynesian ideas. So which economic model is the best one to use? It depends. Now let's look a little bit more at the models. We've seen so far that the three-phase aggregate supply curve has three phases. We've seen the classical phase so far, and the Keynesian phase, Now, this middle part right here is the intermediate range. Now, all of these aggregate supply curves relate to the production possibilities curve. Okay, when production is inefficient, an entity is operating at a point inside the production possibilities curve. So let's say right here, okay, let's label that point A. And so at point A, this point is going to relate to the Keynesian range on the aggregate supply curve. Okay. So it's going to relate to the Keynesian range right here. Because at this point, we are our prices have fallen as far as they can. Okay, we're below full employment, and we're in that recessionary time period. As an economy starts getting closer to its production capabilities, to a point just inside the curve, let's say right here, point B, resources start getting scarcer, and they force an upward pressure on prices. And this is going to relate to the intermediate range of the aggregate supply curve. Okay, right here. As an economy gets to its capacity, it's a point on the curve. As it gets to where it's at full employment, okay, the economy is using its resources to the most efficient way that it can. And at this point, I'm going to label it point C, and this is the classical range on the aggregate supply curve. And so notice how these things kind of relate. So anything that would cause my production possibilities curve to shift out or in, it would cause my classical range of my aggregate supply curve to shift out or in as well. All right, now let's look over at the new classical range, new classical model. Notice that in the new classical model, that actually is very similar to the new Keynesian model. First of all, the new classical doesn't have three phases though, but it does have a long run aggregate supply curve, okay, and it has a short run aggregate supply curve. That's how it divides it up. Now, let's compare new Keynesian to the classical. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the new Keynesian, I'm going to turn the whole thing blue, and I'm going to take the new classical, and I'm going to put the whole thing as red. Let me put this. All right, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to copy this new Keynesian, and I'm going to put it over, I'm going to superimpose it on top of my new classical. Now, what do you notice, first of all? Well, as we're looking at this, I want you to notice that there's a lot of similarity here. First of all, there's a little bit of a difference. First of all, there is no Keynesian range on the blue, on the new classical, the red model. Okay, there is no. This right here only exists on the new Keynesian range. Now, the similarity is in the intermediate range in both models. Notice that it's very similar. They're even got the same slope going right here. Although, notice that the new classical range goes beyond full employment, while the new Keynesian range stops at full employment. Okay. And then notice that the long-run aggregate supply curve exists on both of them as well. All right, so let me put the model back, and let's look at them separately a little bit. Okay, so again, there is no Keynesian range in Model 3. Okay, so this range right here, I mean not in Model 3, in new classical range, it doesn't exist. Sorry, that doesn't exist. notice that the New Keynesian intermediate range does not stretch out as far as the New Classical range. But other than that, they're, again, very similar. They both have long-run active supply curves. If I was to draw the long-run active supply part of the New Keynesian range, it would go right down to full employment, just the way the long-run active supply curve does in the New Classical. So there's a lot more similarities than there are differences. So which is a better one to use? Well, it depends. Because it depends on what you're trying to show and what you're trying to emphasize. Each model has its own advantages and disadvantages. They each can kind of explain the same scenario in a different way. I like showing the New Keynesian